Hi everyone, my name is Ashish, and today I'm presenting work that a few people in our lab had done. So there are a few pictures here. These are just pictures of the people who are present at the conference. In case you have any questions when you are looking at the presentation and you want to come and ask questions later on, then feel free to come and chat with any one of us. So namely, it's me, Ashish Gurung, and then there's Kirk Banacor, Andrew McReynolds, Anthony Botello, and Neil Heffernan, who is my advisor. Apart from the group that are shown there in pictures, we also had other collaborators, Sami Baral, who is from WPI, Hilary Kreisberg, who is from Leslie, and Stacy Saw, who is a cognitive psychologist from WPI as well. Stacy's name is a little bit important down the presentation, so I'll just highlight that right now. And before I begin, I'd like to thank I'd like to highlight that the grant that this work was funded under was NSF CSSI grant that was awarded to Neil Heffernan and Ryan Baker. All right, so common wrong answers. Common wrong answers necessarily is not a new topic in our domain because basically a few researchers in the past have extensively explored this work. So in prior works have essentially called these things bugs, and then those bugs have essentially led to the development of diagnostic models that are trying to hypothesize various ways students might have used to solve those mathematical problems. And then those led to various repair theories, proposals where various researchers had tried to address these common wrong answers that generally occur. So in our work, we define common wrong answers as the incorrect attempts that commonly occur when students are working on math problems. And it's important to note here that for this work, how we're reporting it is we had proactively identified what the common wrong answers for the problems are going to be. And then we had also generated the feedbacks for those common wrong answers. So we're essentially going to explore how effective those feedbacks were. So as I mentioned, the process essentially was we exposed a bunch of teachers to these problems that had been generated, and then we asked them hey, if you as a teacher saw students working on this from your experience and domain expertise, what do you think are the various ways where the students would enter certain errors in this process, and how would you remediate them? Which is how we basically ended up with first identifying what the common wrong answers were, analyzing how they would occur, and then possibly remediating them. And here's a template that was eventually developed by our in-house curriculum designers over various interactions with teachers. To be completely honest, this work was done about 10 years ago. So unfortunately, the nuanced details of the level of interaction and what were said by the teachers have unfortunately been lost to the sands of time. But we do know that we did enough where templates were generated that were informed by the teachers, and then we used these templates to essentially generate problems. So here's an example problem, how it looks like. And then in this case, -2 is a common wrong answer that was deemed as a common wrong answer that would occur. And here's the feedback that would be given if a student enters the common wrong answer. As you can see in the template over here, the variables are shown on the side, and then there's a problem template as well. The first one is an example of how the correct answer would be generated. And then if the student entered a common wrong answer, then here's what the proposed solution to the entire process was, right? And this is a little bit different from other works that assessments generally does. I just want to make sure that this is highlighted beforehand. So we generally give agency to the students when they're asking for help. This is slightly different from those works. Here, the common wrong answer feedback is entirely automated and immediate. As soon as you make the common wrong answer, you are given the feedback, so we don't necessarily let the student decide whether they want to see it or not. Okay, so in order to explore this work, we essentially built 2 experiments. Both of them were mastery-based activities. So mastery-based activities in assessments are called skill builders. Essentially, you need to answer 3 consecutive problems correctly to demonstrate that you have mastery over the topic. So here's an example of a problem and an associated common wrong answer with it. And this was done on the order of operation activity that's based on the Common Core standard for grade 7. And here are a few more examples, just so for the same problem with a different common wrong answer, just to give some more context. All right. So let's look at the second activity. The second activity was on 2-step equations. So 2-step equations was worked on by a different cohort of teachers with a different curriculum designer within our platform. And here's an example that I had shown in the prior slide as well. And then here are some additional examples of the various common wrong answer feedbacks that the students received. All right. All right, so now that we have established what's happening in terms of common wrong answer and common wrong answer feedbacks, so what are our research questions? So first off, we want to figure out, because this work was done proactively, how accurate were these teachers and this activity in general in identifying what the real common wrong answers that are actually going to occur within the system when students are actually working on it. Because if it's not accurate at all, then it's a little bit of a concern and perhaps not the optimal way to approach this problem. And once we complete that exploration, we'll also explore what the learning outcomes of this activity was. Like, because these are mastery-based assignments, is it the case that getting exposed to this type of feedback led to better mastery rates, or were students wheel spinning less often? So there are various measures that are considered reliable measures of learning outcomes within the mastery-based activity that assessment uses, which are under the skill builder. And then the final question we wanted to look at is a correlational analysis, where we wanted to see if high-performing and low-performing students were affected differently by the exposure to these common wrong answer feedbacks. All right. So as I already mentioned, we had proactively generated these common wrong answers. Once the templates were run after all the identification, exploration, and remediation processes that had been completed, we ended up with 54 problems in the order of operation activity, and then 52 problems in two-step equation. And then those 54 problems had 270 common wrong answers, and each common wrong answer had an associated common wrong answer feedback with it. And in the two-step equation, we had 359. Naturally, it seems like teachers thought that students were more likely to go wrong in the two-step equation because it's a relatively more complex process. All right, so experimental design. The students were randomized into a control and treatment condition, and then it's a skill builder, so you get a daily limit of 10 problems, and then you have to essentially answer 3 consecutive problems correctly to exhibit mastery. If you don't achieve mastery within the first 10 problems, then you are labeled as a wheel spinner. And on occasions where, let's say, you answer the 9th and 10th problem correctly, then the daily limit is set to 11, because you can still make a 3 consecutive chain there. And then if you answer the 10th problem correctly, then the daily limit is pushed to 12 so that you can still exhibit mastery over the concept. So just highlighting this, that there are other potential outcomes as well. In this work, we only focused on mastery and wheel spinning, but there's also a lot of researchers also focus on dropout rates, but we did not focus on it due to constraints in terms of like the length of the work or breadth of the work, I suppose. And okay, so these were deployed 10 years ago, as I had mentioned, and then data were collected across 9 academic years, starting from the academic year 13-14 all the way to the summer of 22. And as you can see, we collected data during the regular school year as well as during the summer. I see a question. I'm going to ignore it for now. I'll come back to it later. All right, so high-level experimental descriptives. So some students did the order of operations, others did the two-step equation. Because they were in the same grade, it was often the case that there were instances where students did both. So we had to be a little bit more conservative in our analysis, and we dropped the instances where the students were exposed to the treatment for the second time. If you look at the counts for the classes and the assignments, you'll see that the counts do not exactly add up. That's because in certain classes, when the teacher gave out the assignment, half the classes did it, and there were like a certain group of students who did not do that assignment. But then when they got reassigned in the other group, they ended up doing it. So there's like an overlap there. But because they were never actually exposed to the treatment in the first condition, so we essentially held on to them as well, which is why like the numbers do not exactly add up. All right. So here is what the actual data looks like. So across the 2 activities, in the order of operation, as I had mentioned before, there were 270 common wrong answers with feedbacks, and in the two-step equation from the process that we had used, there were 359 common wrong answers. But in reality, when we used a threshold of n is greater than 10, meaning that if more than 10 students give this particular common wrong answer, then we basically are labeling is that, okay, this is common enough where perhaps it needs to be remediated by the teacher. And then here's what we saw in terms of numbers. In the order of operation, all the common wrong answers that occurred more than 10 times had been identified by the teachers in the past. But the ratio is, there's like a huge disparity in the proportions. And then in terms of two-step equation, the proportion between the identified and observed was relatively more balanced than the other activity, but there were also instances where several common wrong answers that occurred more than 10 times were actually never identified by the teacher. Right. Okay, so let's look at this frequency chart. So before I go there, so there were on average, like because there were 104 problems, so if you do like a rough count, then there were like 127 incorrect attempts per problem. All right, so high level, this is what the distribution looks like. And what the blue lines here indicate that the common wrong answer was correctly identified by the teacher, whereas the red lines indicate that the teachers were not able to identify the common wrong answers that actually occurred. As you can see, there are few instances where they occurred more than 50 times, which is a little bit concerning. But I guess a little bit of an interesting factor is like at the end of the tail where it's closer to n is greater than 10, it seems like the distribution is pretty even. So there might be smaller groups of common wrong answers that are still occurring, which are relatively harder to identify while using like a diagnostic approach where the teachers analyze the processes beforehand. All right. Okay, so before we move into the next section where we're going to look at the effects on the students of receiving these common wrong answers, I'll quickly remind what the two common wrong answer feedbacks look like across the two activities. And because I think everyone is still digesting their lunch, let's do like a quick activity. Who here thinks common wrong answer feedback exposure is a good idea? I guess raise a hands, please. Okay, if you don't raise a hand, then it means it's a bad idea, just so you know. All right, awesome.
Do you mean good idea in principle, or do we think that students will learn more as a consequence?
They will learn more. Yeah. So let's.
And you'll detect that.
Yes. Yep. Okay. Essentially, we're going to look at the results. Who here thinks the result is going to be positive? Who here thinks the result is going to be negative? I guess is the real question. Okay. Okay. Sure. Null as well. Yep. All right. Positives.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Awesome. Okay. Negatives.
Is that null?
I see. Okay. Nulls. Nice.
1,
Okay.
2, 3, 4, 5.
All right, awesome. Okay, it seems like it's leaning positive. All right, so let's look at the results. We have broken it down into several steps, but all right. So here's what the results look like across both activities. All right, what we observed was that, so there's the model, and then we're essentially observing the effects. And what we observed, unfortunately, was that it seems like, so the 0-0 origin here is the control, and the treatment group is essentially, we're looking at the log likelihood of the treatment group answering the problem correctly, achieving mastery as well. And we saw that students who were assigned to the treatment condition of receiving common wrong answer feedback were less likely to master the activity, which I guess is a problem. All right, so let's look at the two-step equation activity. The two-step equation had a relatively longer feedback to it, and then it seems that there was a significant difference between the control and treatment group, where students in the treatment group were less likely to master the activity. And then next we looked at the order of operations, and then here the data was leaning relatively positive, but it still was not significant. Right. And here we're looking at all of them at the same place. All right. So next we looked at wheel spinning as well. Wheel spinning was our other learning outcome. And when we looked at both of them, students who received common wrong answer feedback were more likely to wheel spin. So wheel spin is a measure of persistence, and essentially students who do not drop out but end up persisting until the 10th problem without achieving mastery, it indicates that they are at least like putting in some effort. It's akin to getting your vehicle stuck in ice or mud, and you are just applying effort, but the car is not moving forward. So that essentially is is how, I guess, Joe Beck kind of coined it. So when we looked at the two-step equation, it appeared that the students who were in the two-step equation were more likely to wheel spin, whereas students in the order of operation, it was still leaning in the positive direction, but the findings were not significant. Right? And then if we look at them together in the end, then this was what the results we saw for the wheel spinning behavior was. All right. So finally, this is the last bit of our exploration. We also looked at the heterogeneous treatment effects across different prior knowledge. And Here's essentially what we saw. The first two columns where we are looking at both activities and two-step equation were not very surprising. What was surprising was that in the order of operation in the previous analysis, like there was no difference between the treatment and the control condition, which is still the case, but higher performing students are less likely to master when they get exposed to common wrong answer feedbacks as well. So it seems like in the case where we did not find any significant result, but it was leaning positive, still if you're a higher performing student, then you are likely to get hurt by it. So for the order of operation activity, we basically pulled out the log likelihood and plotted them down. And if you see, then here on the right-hand side, it appears that students, higher performing students who were in the control condition were significantly more likely to do better than the students in the common wrong answer feedback condition. I mean, if you really squint, then you might say, oh, there's a difference here as well. But it might entirely be the case that the difference here is actually influencing the curves. Okay, I'm really running out of time. So limitation and future work. We want to do next steps. We want to do causal forest and figure out what are the interesting bits within the, by putting in more features about the class, teachers, and essentially figure out if there are like other internal and external factors that are influencing the student behaviors. And the real takeaway here is that students can be more sensitive to common wrong answer feedbacks. So it looks like we need to be really careful when doing this work, because unlike hints and explanations, it seems like these feedbacks can lead to unforeseen outcomes. And in terms of like practical reality, when it comes to like implementing these kind of ideas into perhaps other platforms, I'd say that doing a proactive approach perhaps is not the most productive. We might want to do something more data-driven where maybe like initially expose the students to some questions and figure out what the common wrong answers are, and then just iteratively build on it. Okay. Yep, this technically is the end of the presentation. Before I take questions, we did build on the work. So this is like, because 6 months has passed since we submitted this for review. So we did some exploratory work as to like why it did not work. Neil will briefly talk about this.